Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, in light of yet another reminder of extreme corporate greed, taking advantage of the poorest in society via essential public services, time to talk about nationalisation again. What is likely and what is feasible but tricky. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So I've been interested in politics from a very young age. I had a computer game at the age of about 6 where you got to run the government. It's brilliant. I was really bad at it. I was trying to be nice all the time. I ended up causing hyperinflation and lost power within a year. I like to think I've learned a few things in the 40 years since, but growing up was also against a background of privatization. Rail, water, telecoms, energy, all of it happened as I was growing up. There have been other public services since. People were promised that it would be run more efficiently. The suggestion was we'd get a better service, more investment, and it would all be cheaper. And even as a child, you think, how does that add up? Where's the profit going to come from then? They all immediately provided a worse service and became much more expensive. The teenage me was, well, that's surprising. Not. Of course they became worse. How could it be otherwise? Any organisation has to please those that have power over them. In a functioning private organisation, that would be the customers and their workers. In a privatised public service, however, it's shareholders. There are other organisations where the shareholder satisfaction is really important as well. But if their product's non-essential, well, they can't ignore their customers because their customers can just go elsewhere or just stop buying the product. But when it's an essential public service, well, that's different. You can't just boycott energy or water. So you're stuck with them. These companies also don't care about your efforts to reduce your consumption. If you just start doing that, they'll just put the prices up to meet the profit requirements because they know you can't do without the service. The front page of the Daily Star today described the CEOs of Centrica and Shell as being money-grabbing scumbags. And it's easy to see why these people would be the focus of anger for such corporate greed. But the reality is the blame is misplaced. These CEOs can't just rein in profit. It'd piss off the shareholders and they'd replace them with someone who will prioritise profits. Not that I think the CEOs are just innocents caught in the crossfire. They chose to work in an industry which means they have to impoverish their customers for great sacks of cash. But there's no way of them doing the right thing because they'd instantly lose their job and be replaced by someone who would reverse the policy. It's the government who need to rein them in. Unregulated capitalism doesn't work. Communism doesn't work either. No point going to the other extreme. But politics in my lifetime, against the background of the Cold War as I was growing up, tended to focus on choosing between the two. They're both rubbish. It's just that communism collapsed first. Capitalism didn't win. It just struggled on longer. So what can we do about it? Well, the obvious answer is just to re-nationalise all public services. I even someone in the comments say just re-nationalise, don't even compensate the shareholders, just take it. It's like, yeah, that's theft. We can't do that. That's theft. And it's not theft what the corporations are doing at the moment in terms of swindling people. It's greed. It's not theft. But there are ways and means where you don't have to break the law. But in terms of getting public approval is key. It's quite easy to expose how much of a disaster privatisation has been because it's like Brexit. It's so bad. If you can sit down with someone and point a few things out, it's actually quite easy to persuade them. The problem is that this case isn't being made to the public. People will point out there's actually quite a high approval rate for nationalised public services, especially since the 2008 global crash and, of course, with the latest crisis with the cost of living. But this fails to understand that we don't have the sort of democracy where the majority opinion matters. You can see any number of polls saying, 60% of the population agree with this. So, no, it doesn't matter. We've got a first past the post system where, in reality, it doesn't matter how you vote in like 500 of the 650 seats up for grabbing a general election. It really doesn't matter. It could matter. I'm not saying it can't matter mathematically. Like if everyone turned out to vote, well, that's different. There isn't a safe seat in the land where the MP has a majority greater than the number of people who don't vote in that area. But that's not going to happen. That's just realistically, if you're in one of those seats, do whatever because it doesn't make any difference. But even in the roughly 150 seats where your vote can make a difference, realistically, it's still not a majority of voters in even those seats that matter. Most will still vote as they always have. It's only the swing voters who matter. That amounts to about 10% of all the people who vote, or about 0.5% of the population. What value is there in showing that 60% of the population have a particular opinion if only 0.5% of them decide who forms the next government? When it comes to politics, the question always needs to be asked, where do the 0.5% stand on this? And right now, where the 0.5% stand on this is believed to be not impressed with the rubbish that privatisation has delivered. They're certainly not adherents of privatisation, but they're not that bothered about it either. They certainly don't want the country to rack up the debt and re-nationalise. The Tory media push this fear a lot. They don't bother to mention that the Tories have more than doubled our national debt without us getting any return at all, which is why the debt keeps going up. Classic Keynesian economics holds that you do borrow and spend during tough times, but then you repay in the better times. Germany did this after the 2018 crash. They brought their debt back down to pre-crash levels, which meant that it was then available for the next emergency. We were on track to do the same thing with Labour, but then the Tories came in and just kept piling it on. But borrowing to re-nationalise can be economically sensible, as long as you do it competently. Once you have a public service under government control, you can improve the service, you can pay workers more and reduce the cost for consumers. And still have enough to be able to pay off that borrowing. You know, you pay for all this by having zero to pay to shareholders. You may need to still pay a high price to get the best CEOs for these nationalised industries. I have no issue with that at all. Pay whatever you need to get the best people to run it. Just the savings in terms of zero payments to shareholders, because the shareholders are basically the Treasury, means that you can redistribute wealth to those who are actually creating the wealth, which is the workers and never the shareholders. And you can pay off the money you borrowed to pay for it all. But economic arguments don't work on the public, who have a hard time saying, yeah, but then I'd have to ignore the Daily Mail and what they're telling me. Which brings me to Labour's policies. Now, because obviously we know that this isn't realistically going to happen under a Conservative government. Now, it has to be said that Labour have been a bit messy with this week. It's not a regular thing, but the fact that these things do happen shows me they're still not coordinating their messages internally well enough. And if they're not even sorting out their messages internally, then it's worrying for getting messages out there as well. But after some messing about and some misquotes, Keir Starmer did come out and say, look, nationalising rail, pragmatic choice, that's going to happen. This is based on the notion that some of the network's already in public hands. Because we should remember that although unchecked capitalism hasn't completely collapsed yet, there have been isolated failures. The Conservatives have actually re-nationalised a few services in their time, usually without any great fanfare. Most of the public don't even know about it because they don't like to talk about it. Otherwise people go, oh, if privatisation is so good, how come you've re-nationalised what was a private service then? They don't want to be dealing with questions like that. The other thing is that still existing privatisation in rail is on a contract basis. So when the contract comes to an end, the government can just choose not to reissue. So the next Labour government can re-nationalise rail without having to stump up a load of money to buy out shareholders, because they just wait for the contract to come to an end and say, that's it, we'll not issue another one. But when it comes to other privatised services, can be trickier. Labour have committed to balancing the books. This means their spending has got to match their income. So they can only spend what they raise in tax revenues. So no borrowing except for unforeseen emergencies. They have to do this to be electable. There were a number of things that tripped Labour up in 2019, and one of them was this belief that Corbyn would bankrupt the country. No point whining about how untrue it was. It's what crucial voters thought and still think. They still fear the Tory media's accusations of tax and spend as if it's somehow a bad thing. So a Labour leadership that wants to win the election has to play the game. You know, they can try and say as much as they like. No, as Corbyn did. No, actually, even if you're on basically, if you're on more than double the national median income, you won't be paying a penny in extra tax under us. In fact, if you're earning treble, you'll pay a few pounds extra tax. It's only the very, very wealthy that are going to be paying a significant amount extra tax. Don't matter how much you told them that, people didn't believe it because the Daily Express was saying something different. You know, so Labour wants to win the election now, that's clear, and they're prioritising that. You can nationalise rail because it's basically free as long as you wait. You can also use it to give instant improvements and demonstrate to people the benefits of nationalisation because they won't do it quietly. And then you can encourage wider support for more nationalisation. Energy is trickier. Labour's policy on energy and water, for example, it's often misreported as them saying they won't nationalise it. It's not quite the case. What the policy is that they won't promise to nationalise it, which some people think means, oh, that's because they don't want to nationalise it. It's not. The aim is to bring them under public control, but on a strict balance in the books basis, which means it can't be done quickly. And because it would take longer than a single parliament, if you do a slowly approach, they can't promise to nationalise them in the manifesto because a manifesto is for one parliament and it's an impossible promise to keep for that one parliament. But they could do something with energy. Now, France, of course, always good to look at France, right next door to us, very similar country, similar levels of wealth, GDP and population. They have a publicly owned energy company, EDF. We pay for it in the UK as if it were a private company, but the profits go to the French government. EDF is currently mostly owned by the French state. They're about to take complete control over it because apparently the private bit of it's whining about Macron keeping the energy prices down for the people. So he's just going to buy the rest of it. Now, I have seen a suggestion that although it would be too costly to just re-nationalise energy, what the government could do as a low-cost solution, relatively low cost, I don't know how much this would be, but it would surely be interesting. So they set up a public company in the sector, like our own EDF, okay, which is completely owned by the state. And when a smaller provider, because there's so many, although there's like a big half dozen energy companies, there's loads of tiny little ones, not as many as there were a year ago. So when these smaller providers go bust, and they will go, they have been doing so, they will carry on doing so. Instead of using public money to try and save some of them, which is what the government have been doing, just take their customers. Have the public company just take their customers. Over time, you build this public energy company up to the size whereby it's as large as the big boys. And one of the attractive features of it is you set it up differently as well. So no standing charge. Get rid of the standing charge. So if you don't use any, you don't pay anything. Keep prices capped lower for lower income households. You know, so make it more attractive as well. And I suppose what would then happen is, over time, when the big energy providers, once this has grown, when the big energy providers try and whack up their prices, the public company doesn't. They keep theirs low. Again, they maintain the no standing charge, a lower cap for poorer households. They advertise this fact to the people. And what do people do then? Are they going to pay the higher prices for the greedy private companies, or are they going to switch to the cheaper public company? So you could set something like this up, and I don't know how much it would be, but if it was relatively inexpensive, and then just be patient. In the meantime, there is definitely need for much tighter regulation of the privatised public services which are too costly or too tricky to bring straight into public hands. We certainly can't have water companies dumping raw sewage into our rivers. It's all very well then blaming crumbling Victorian infrastructure. They say, oh, it's not our fault, it's the crumbling Victorian infrastructure. Yeah, see, thing is, I remember when water was privatised and Thatcher said, she said, oh, they'll invest to modernise the infrastructure. You'll get loads of investment. Oh, it'll be brilliant. We're going to bring it right up to date. So why do they still have a crumbling Victorian infrastructure 30 years later then? Why is that? It's the same as the energy companies making silly profits now. Do you know what they're saying? Do you know what they're doing to excuse it? They're saying, oh, don't worry, we're going to use the money to work on achieving net zero. Yeah, mate, heard it all before. It's what we've always been told. Privatisation means we'll get more money going into improving the system. Never does. It never can, because those shareholders want their money. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.